I have the pleasure of introducing Manoush Zamorodi. I've heard a show called New Tech City back in the, I guess it would have been like 7-8 years ago. And I had been a big Benjamin Walker listener. He's another Radiotopia person, but Benjamin Walker was like for the people of that world. And the great thing about hearing Manoush is she seemed as curious and as suspicious and as forward-thinking, and yet she was speaking to other people. And so I got kind of hooked on this show. That show got renamed Note to Self. That show, Note to Self, is now on Luminary. Manoush is co-founder of Stable Genius Productions, which is a great name for a production company. She is also the host of, or co-host with Jen, of ZigZag on Radiotopia, and for a while on Civil. And it was great to hear somebody else's journey through a technology startup that didn't turn out as they expected, having been on that journey myself. She's also finally the incoming host of the TED Radio Hour. People in the room, please welcome Manoush.
Blake, I just realized that you can tell what I want to talk about based on my liquids. There we go.
All right, I only brought one.
I need all my liquids.
Okay, so Manoush, before you were a podcaster, you were a TV reporter.
Yes.
And you, I guess the last phase of your TV career was covering tech and business for Reuters.
That's right.
And so what kind of stories did you work on then, and who were they for?
Oh my God, the most boring stories. So this was, I was getting ready to talk to Blake, and I wrote down a list of all the business models, of all the companies that I've worked for, and all the ways that I've provided for myself, and they each go down the page. And so Reuters, of course, before Reuters, I worked for the BBC, which was, of course, government funded, and I was a staffer. And then when I left the BBC, I went to work for Reuters as a freelancer. And of course, Reuters is a syndication model, and they have clients, news people. And my job was to, full disclosure, this was at a point in my career where I was also having another job, which was making babies. And so it worked really well for me to go in and do shift work, which I hadn't done. And I would go in and cover the markets and talk about how much a barrel of oil cost. And honestly, I didn't really care who I was saying that for. I didn't really understand what it meant to be why did this matter? Oil futures and things like that. Or covering the tech stuff I would cover would be this is a robot falcon. Cool, it feels so crazy to me that within a couple years, I really didn't think of myself as a tech or a business person. And now that is how I define myself. And for me, it was really this transition that happened with technology. And again, it comes back to being a parent, where that moment when I was on the playground and I finally had one of these and I could be part of a conference call and in theory making sure my kid wasn't falling off the jungle gym, and this idea that you could be multiple people at once. And it just kind of blew my mind. I was like, whoa, this is changing how people parent, how they fall in love, the work they do, every single thing. It was more like a sociological experiment that was happening. And as a journalist, that was oh, well, that's the story. That's what I want to cover.
I mean, so the word privacy did not come up much when you were working for Reuters?
Never.
Never. It was just never something you were talking about.
No.
But I mean, it's really all of these things kind of come together. Your interest in tech, you're becoming an entrepreneur, and you're becoming a parent. And so, so it seems like privacy was somehow baked into these things that you were thinking about from the beginning.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I think that's actually why we changed the name of the show from New Tech City to Note to Self. So some of you might remember we did an interactive project with our listeners called Bored and Brilliant, where we got 20,000 people to sort of try to be bored for a week, which at the time seemed really weird, but now, like, I wrote a book about it, I gave a TED Talk about it, and to me it was this realization that my inner self was somehow being invaded. Sounds negative, but I think that's okay. Invaded by corporations and the government. And it was really, I didn't quite understand it, and so we started with that project, this idea of looking at mindfulness and how we relate to our devices and our daily digital habits, and Shoshana Zuboff, people like that. I sort of started reading their papers and starting to understand what they were looking for. And then when we switched over to Note to Self, I think there was a core group of people who really understood why that name made so much sense. But a lot of people also didn't. So we did another project called Info Magical, which was about information overload. And we had 40,000 people sign up for that. This idea of how do you stop the infinite scroll, like if you want to? How do you begin to do more with the information that you take in all day long? And then the last project we did was called The Privacy Paradox. And this was January 2017, before the Cambridge Analytica incident. And that's crucial, I think, in the timeline. And we had 50,000 people sign up for that. And it was interesting to me because people were like, I don't understand what the problem is. I want to understand it. It feels creepy. Like this one woman was like, I download Facebook Messenger, and then I get creeped out, and I delete it, and then I download it again, and then I delete it again, and then I download it again, and I delete it again.
Right. And at this point, like, that's, I think, where a lot of the public was. Meanwhile, I was in 2017 working at an ed tech company where the people who had worked at Google didn't have a public, like, they were very careful about having a public profile on Google. They knew what was, so like the people who had worked in these companies were aware of it. You know, I always associate this paranoia with like my dad and like, you know, kind of just sort of general suspicious, don't let them know what you're doing, and computers, you know, a suspicion of computers, you know, like, but like when you did the privacy paradox, what I want to ask is like, what kind of, you were giving people advice on things like use a password manager. That's a big issue in my marriage, by the way. How to use a password manager. Turning off smart speakers. Sewing one of those Faraday pouches with like the metal webbing around. So how did podcast listening come up in your privacy project?
It didn't, to be honest. I mean, so I should be clear, we weren't just giving advice. I think for us it was an exploration of where do you as a person, as an individual, draw the line when it comes to privacy? And I think that that's where we are finally in a mainstream way, right? So this was like, I think people who are a little ahead of the curve, that was typically Note to Self listeners anyway, and then Cambridge Analytica happens, and you know, you have this mainstream understanding of the actual power of the big tech companies to track our every move, to micro-target us, to know where we are, for better or worse, right? You know, for convenience sake, it's awesome. For nefarious reasons, like, it's not so awesome. But I was reading this New Yorker article about, have you guys read the profile of Yuval Harari, the historian in the New Yorker? It's really good. Anyway, he has this quote that I was like, that's it. Freedom depends to a large extent on how much you know yourself. And you need to know yourself better than, say, the government or the corporations that try to manipulate you. And I think I laughed and was like, oh, paranoia, like, but every time I would come up with a like wacky scenario, it would be true. They really could track you wherever you were going, or they really were listening on your TV. And so that was a real, like, I felt very naive. And I thought, you know, it made me think, because I think I was coming to tech as a person who hadn't drunk the Kool-Aid, but more as just the consumer and user and parent and person in the world. I guess I had assumed that, like, so naive. I guess I'd assumed that the big corporations at the end of the day would understand that their business models depend on the trust of their customers. And they haven't made that calculation. I do think that that's the next chapter, but I totally did not answer your question. I can't even remember what it is.
No. I mean, so, but like, well, why don't I what I want to say about that is like, you were...
Oh, did podcasting come up?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
back to that.
Okay.
Why we're all here. I get very excited about privacy. No, it did not come up. And I think it's important to mention what was going on at the time when it comes to advertising and podcasting. So as a person who was working for New York Public Radio, obviously that's its own bag. It relies on the Sloan Foundation and other very generous corporations to support us. It relies on membership. Call 1-888-763, that whole thing. And also, more and more it was starting to be ads. And so, I remember the day when copy came in front of me for a host-read ad, the very first one, and there was never a conversation. Like, how do I feel about that? Do we like the copy? Do I support this company? Like, there was no conversation, because I think we were at this point, especially with public media, where you're like, how are we gonna survive, right? And so I was making content that I felt extremely proud of, and that becomes the most important thing. For me, one of the, a moment that happened was when a particular sponsor raised the ire of some of our listeners, and they said, I'm so sorry, I can't listen to your show anymore because you had an ad with that company. And it was a politically divisive sort of, and I didn't even know the ad was running on because it wasn't a host-read one. And so that was the first time I sort of started to wake up to this idea of what, we have a very particular perspective with the work that Jen and I make, and if the advertising doesn't align with it, it's really jarring.
Right.
And that's different than if it's an entertainment podcast or true crime or any of those things. Like, ours is very specific, and it's one of the reasons why becoming an entrepreneur is so exciting. And what do the people say when they don't want to say it's difficult? Challenging. Yes, so challenging.
Full of challenges.
Yeah.
So you've just, in that last answer, made the switch that sort of segue. So in Note to Self, you were the stand-in for the listener. You were seeing things from the perspective of the listener. And when I was asking there, I'm like, well, what did you talk about listening to podcasts? And honestly, like, the Privacy Project of the New York Times also didn't really talk about it. They've had they had a couple of asides about it, but podcasting was not one of the things that came up in the 170 and counting articles. So, like, as a consumer, I don't know how much I was conscious as I was walking around listening to podcasts of what was happening to me, what kind of data was I generating, where was it going?
But to be clear, also those of us in podcasting, because of RSS and the way that the tech worked, we kind of felt insulated, right? We're like, we're the good guys. We don't have to think about this. We're like, cool. We make like stuff that's for the public value. We also have like really antiquated technology, so we can't even possibly track you. Like, we got this. You know what I mean? But now, as we're past that for sure.
But you're mentioning that shift in perspective from you as the stand-in from the listener to you as the stand-in for the producer. You are a producer of you are a host, you are a producer, and you're an entrepreneur. And so maybe this is a good time to go back to that list. Because, because you're at, for those of you who did not listen to the first season of ZigZag, or for those of you who listened to it at the time. So basically what happens is you and Jen are at WNYC. You hear you're going to get a grant. You leave. You don't get the grant. And then you basically find yourself, like many tech startups, with not a lot of runway. And trying to, and your high standards. And needing money.
Damn high standards, I know.
And so, like, what do you, like, how much was privacy a question then? Like, what, or like, one of the things they say is part of the great thing about those moments in tech is you figure out what's actually essential to you and what's, as they call it, nice to have, which means will never happen.
Well, so to clarify, what happened was my executive producer, Jen Poyant, and I decided we wanted to start our own company because we wanted more control over our content, and we were supposed to have a grant, and that did not work out. So we ended up joining, anybody heard of Civil? Okay, this is my crowd, my people. Yes, you've heard of Civil. And so, we joined this weird crypto experiment, which was extremely exciting. And also, in addition to funding our company, was like some of the really amazing people in journalism. And so I think what it speaks to is that the standards we were using, which are not scalable, just to like go back to Carrie, is trusting the people that we're working with. And like, I know them, I've been around the block for a while, and so do I trust them? Yes, trust but verify, right? Like that's what we're going back to. And I think what Carrie's said in her opening remarks really speaks to the fact that you can't grow like that, right? Like I can't know and love and look soulfully into the eyes of every like business partner. Well, that is what Jen and I are actually doing. But if we've purposefully decided not to grow in some ways because that is our standard. And then there are other people who have like scaling is what they want to do. And at the end of the day, like I think you have to make bigger sacrifices. But when your content is based on a certain set of values, as ours is, that's there's a conflict of interest. So it's hard. Like Jen and I have decided not to run ads on Facebook. And some people are like, well, that's stupid. And I'm like, well, have you listened to the work that I do? Like that really would not send the right message. Or we want to, if we're going to do ads, we want it to do it that like it's making fun of the ads, like explaining why you were targeted, and then come to we haven't figured that one out. But like that's one idea that we.
Right, and I mean, but you're certainly not alone in this. I mean, this morning the markup launched. Which
was that today?
It's this morning.
Oh my God,
yes.
Julia Engman, yes.
Yes, so, and part of the markup is a new sort of single-purpose newsroom, collaborative newsroom, and part of their thing is they don't take ads.
Right.
They don't collect any data about you
right.
as as a reader, and because of that, and that's how they earn your trust. And and then they're hoping that you'll become a member. I mean, it's early days. They have grants. They have
Craig Newmark.
There will be people who will be giving them. That's another symposium.
Yes.
There'll be people who are giving them, who want to give them money because they've taken that stand. But how many do they need? How do they know where to look for them? Like, I mean,
Well, again, like here we are. I would put money on anything Julia Engman does. I think she's unbelievable. She's a good person. She's an incredible investigative journalist. And so again, though, that's not scalable. Like
right.
We can't be like, was she like Julia? No, but so like Julia's amazing. And I have to say, like, it's really interesting to see the portfolio that Craig is putting together in terms of Consumer Reports being another place that's building out its digital privacy lab in order to start to vet some of the products that we use every day. I think that's really exciting. Like Carrie's I'm a nerd. Standards.
No,
digital privacy standards are also very exciting to me, Carrie.
Consumer Reports was one of the few organizations that never took ads.
That's right.
In the old days, it was like the magazine we got with no ads in it.
But I'm no Pollyanna. To be clear, I read host-read ads, and I'm trying to think of. Oh, I have an Everlane jacket on right now. So like, this is the world we live in, and I am extremely, like, my whole thing is experimenting.
Right.
And that's where I get excited and jazzed, and Jen will have to be like, okay, like, let's just see if the other one works first.
But it's not just experimenting, it's talking through the experiment.
Yes.
That's part of what you're doing. I mean, there's a lot of people who are experimenting and have furnished their apartments with mattresses and whatever, and have realized that, like, in the same way that people don't...
Do you have that mattress?
In the same way that, like, you open up Facebook, you download Messenger, you feel creepy, you turn it off. I'm sure there are people in podcasting who, like, we did the mattress ads, I have the mattress, I feel creepy, I fall asleep. I get dressed the next morning, Everlane, I put on the Everlane jacket, I fall asleep. I mean, I think that producer, that's also a producer dynamic, and I've seen it in, in print or whatever, text.
Yes.
Whatever you call it now.
But we say no to a lot of things, like a lot of things. And I think, so that's where I sort of wonder, my fantasy, can I just talk about my ad fantasy?
Yeah.
Okay, so my ad fantasy, which I also have some news I'd love to share if that's okay. So first, the news, which is that actually ZigZag is going to become part of the TED family. So we're really excited. So it kind of made sense. I'm hosting the TED Radio Hour, and for us to have ZigZag come under the TED umbrella really sort of made sense to us. And PRX won't be far away because, of course, Ted and PRX do a lot of projects together, so that's great. And I have to, like, first of all, shout out to Carrie and Roman and Radiotopia for being like, you want to jump ship from WNYC? We'll have you. So they were awesome. So thank you, Radiotopia, for giving us the moral support and financial support to get started. I want to be clear, though, like, we are not, ZigZag is small, and so we have not been able to fund ourselves solely from that ad revenue. And because of our content and because we say no to a lot of things, we make our lives a little bit more difficult. That's where deciding to do Note to Self for Luminary came in. We loved making that show, and this was an opportunity to, get a little financial stability, which we really needed. But what I'm really excited also about going over to TED is that we needed a partner, and we needed a partner who aligned with our values and talked about the things that we talk about. And so we're looking to create sort of new relationships with sponsors and underwriters and find new ways to sort of take ZigZag beyond the podcast, because I think for us, the show has, we called Note to Self the tech show about being human, and we really think of ZigZag as the business show about being human, because I think that's where we are. The tech thing has happened. I'm so glad I wrote it. It was fascinating. I think we're at a point where people get it, and now we have to align the way that we make money and the way that we build our companies and the way that we build our careers to make more of the tech that we think could actually improve our world as opposed to cause more problems. And so that's what ZigZag is really about. Looking at people, yesterday I interviewed Eric Ries. You might know him from the Lean Startup, but he also has started a new stock exchange called the Long-Term Stock Exchange. It's just fascinating to me. He feels exactly the same way. That tech was the story, and now we're moving to the business sort of angle of it. And the tech is part of that because it's part of everything, right? So that's our big news, which is really exciting for me. What was the other thing that we were talking about?
We were talking about, well, let me just ask something else, because
No, there was something else that you had said that. Oh, my ad fantasy.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Let's
Thank
talk
you.
about that. Okay, so my ad fantasy is that we build a, kind of like Radiotopia was a podcasting collective, I want to create an advertising, a brand collective, where you sign on to a certain set of standards for your company, and that if the host reads that ad, they have given it kind of a seal of approval. Like in our fantasy, it's a ZigZag seal of approval, right? That we say, like, these people have signed on to us, they abide by the values of the podcast, and when you hear those ads on there, that's because we really think that you should know about these, because we know because you listen to this show, you also want to live and put your money towards and work with certain sorts of companies.
So instead of pretending that you love the furniture, you can just say, this is a company that follows these standards, and therefore they're worth trusting.
Yeah.
And because you trust us.
Yeah. I have not read a Google commercial. That doesn't answer your question, but I have not yet read a Google commercial.
So
I won't read a Facebook.
So with this focus on business and being human, let's talk about how business models shape what you can produce. And we talked a little bit about scale, but are there, and I guess ZigZag was both in funding and in content, at first about civil and then about other things, but tell us about how you wrestle with that.
Well, and I'm sure there are other people who do it very differently, but for me, it's about the mosaic of all the things, right? And testing, and sometimes one works and then another one doesn't, and then you try something different and then that one doesn't work too. Like, I'm obsessed with newsletters. I've never monetized one, but I read a stupid amount of them, and I think I'm playing the long game with our newsletter. I don't know what's gonna happen to it, but there's something there. I don't know what it is yet. Luminary, that was like, we know how to make this show. We love this show. It's a way that we can actually fill out our Excel spreadsheet for a year. It's subscription. Is that a great fit for the show? At some point you have to make choices. And our choice was like, can our company survive? If we do this, it can. So we did. But we kept ZigZag separate, and ZigZag was part of Radiotopia, and now moving over to TED, and that was its own sort of ad revenue-based thing, and building not a huge moneymaker, but something we really, really believed in and wanted it to just have space and grow. And so keeping it small was like almost on purpose, right? Because we're building our community there. And then I should also add, the other show that I hosted last year was IRL, which was the first time I actually did native advertising. But the only reason I would do that, sponsored content, was because the advertiser was Mozilla. And Mozilla, of course, makes Firefox browser, and privacy is like, that is the point of Mozilla, the Mozilla Foundation. And I will say the Mozilla folks have been so supportive of all my work over the years. They supported Note to Self. And I no doubt they will support us into the future. And so that felt like a really great fit. And there's a great IRL episode with Shoshana Zuboff if you want to learn more about the surveillance economy. It's really great. And that was interesting because I actually worked with the Pacific Content folks out in Vancouver, and they will work for Facebook and they will work for Mozilla. Like, they've made a different choice, and they're super cool, and they just sold their company, and they're Canadian, which is great. So like, I learned a lot just not only by making that show, but by spending time with them and trying to understand how they had built their business. And then Jen and I had the Gimlet guys on ZigZag too, and like that had ended up being like agreeing to disagree, and they're multimillionaires now, and we are so not. But like, I still stand by that conversation that we had in the podcast.
And at the same time, you are still experimenting and talking about it openly, and they have had to, I shouldn't say have had to, they have decided to shut down Startup as a show. They no longer,
Such a good show, too. So good. But, whether or not what we heard in the last season of Startup was real or not, it felt really real. And I felt like I learned a lot just by listening to how things went. Like that, what a great season, listening to all the board members calling in and the decision to make it. And I was like, their company wasn't their own. I mean, I haven't had the conversation with Alex about whether, remember when he would be talking about like his like special little podcast company in the first season, and then this end, like, I don't know if there's a sense of loss there. Probably not a lot when, he goes on vacation to some pretty sweet places, but like, or he's able to see all the amazing other shows that he's able to finance,
And the producers who got to make good work for
absolutely
all that time and continue to get to make good work.
Continue to do. Like, they're making amazing stuff. And, I'll say to Jen, like, did you hear like the number of credits at the end of an episode? She's like, that's what your VC money will get you, girl. And I was like, well, okay, that's the good part, that's the really good part, is to make the stuff. And at the end of the day, that's what it's about, to make the stuff.
So I guess I'll ask one last question, which is, and I worked at a small startup where we worked with people starting magazines, and we had all these people. Everybody says, I want to start a magazine, I'm going to pay my writers. And which, maybe I won't pay myself at the beginning, but I'm going to pay my writers. It's going to be just, all of this, the magazine world is broken. And so, like, what advice do you have for somebody who wants to make a podcast, somebody who, goes to Third Coast or like takes, the PRX tutorials, reads all the Transom tutorials, and they're thinking, I'm making this piece of serial art or this project that I would like to become sustainable. Like, what advice do you have for those people as they are thinking about their projects and developing their projects in terms of, thinking about their business and thinking about what compromises they may inevitably have to make?
Can I just speak to the idea of paying your writers? I think Medium is the most interesting example of that. And again, it comes back to trust, which is like Ev Williams kind of deciding that this was going to be his legacy and not Twitter, and putting his money into that, and they do pay their writers, actually. And I think they're doing amazing stuff on there. That was just a little postscript I had to throw in there. Here's my advice. Really know why you're making your show. And there can be so many reasons, right? It can be because it's something you do for yourself and it's beautiful and you don't expect to make money, but it satisfies some sort of creative need in you, and that is legit. It can be because your CEO likes the sound of his or her own voice, and you need her or him to have an outlet for that, and this is an internal podcast, and makes your job easier. That's legit. It can be because you are a true crime junkie and you know that people will pay for that. No, oh my God, I just threw so much shade with the tone of my voice on true crime, but I am not a true crime lover, but like I get it. So it can, if you think you're gonna make a lot of money, maybe you will. It still is possible. There's just so many reasons to make a podcast and you should know yours because they'll save you a lot of heartache otherwise.
Because then you'll figure out, you'll hit that point where it's like, I can't do this, I need this, what am I willing to trade, what am I not willing to trade?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. And like, I haven't figured it out, but experimenting's really fun and interesting, and as long, I think for me, when I listen to something, like whether it's a TED Radio Hour or when we make a ZigZag episode, like, sit with the feeling. Do I feel proud of what I did? Do I stand by the content? Do I feel like I represented myself properly? Was this a public service? Because that's my thing. And as long as I can keep saying yes, and I can keep paying my mortgage, we're good. Yeah.
All right, well, Manoush, thank you so much.
Thank
That was
you so
great.
much.
So we are going to take a short break right now. There should, unless you all drank all of the coffee and ate all of the sandwiches, there should be food and drink. So we'll reconvene in 15 minutes.